special, very, very special event tonight with one of my favorite people, Kathy Hotelling, who has been a champion for children with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders and has essentially been the voice for children and families who deal with these issues. She's a wonderful speaker. Give us a lot. I know, give you a lot of very specific and good information. So we're very happy to have her with us tonight. So Kathy, you want to take it away?
Okay. Thank you, Joanne. But Gail, I didn't know I could come in my PJs. You said we could.
Well, I have a confession. I actually have my PJ bottoms on. I have a decent top on and my PJ bottoms on. I mean, it's been a long day.
And I'm going to try not to have a cat in this Zoom, but it might happen. But I decided not to wear that filter that the attorney in Texas had on of the cat. So my cat is very fond of getting into these. So I'm really happy to be here tonight. I am co-founder and board chair of NCFASD Informed, which is a nonprofit that is 3 years and 1.5 months old. And I'm pleased that we could do this in cooperation with the Foster Family Alliance. I'm going to just jump right in. I know we have limited amount of time. I want to talk about, obviously tonight, this is about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. The first thing I want to say is that is not a diagnosis in the United States. It is in Canada, but it is not here. But we use that as shorthand, that and or FASD, in order to represent all of those individuals which fall under this umbrella term. And those different diagnoses are listed there underneath. And they have lots of letters, but they just, they're acronyms, but they mean like fetal alcohol syndrome, partial fetal alcohol syndrome. But they basically mean that the individual with an FASD and this specific diagnosis have been affected by exposure to alcohol. And they may be, of course, since it is a spectrum, they're affected in different ways. And those different terminologies, which to me are not as important as whether a child or an adult is diagnosed under this umbrella, it just represents that. So I wanted to start off there because I think often people think FASD is a diagnosis. I want to first talk about facts, and then we'll talk about myths, and we'll go on from there. I love Phil May. He's from UNC Kannapolis, internationally known for research in the FASD world. And years ago, I heard him and he said, alcohol is the big dog. And what he meant is no matter what other teratogen, which alcohol is a teratogen that is introduced to the fetus in utero, whether that be opioids, cocaine, crack, heroin, marijuana, smoking, whatever, that exposure to alcohol has more ramifications probably than all of those together. And it is the #1 cause of intellectual and developmental disabilities. While you may find some learning disabilities and other differences with those individuals who are exposed to the other teratogens, you're not going to have an intellectual and developmental disability as a result of that introduction into the system. And I think it's really important to note that a developmental IDD, as we call that, or INDD, some people prefer, it is important to note that that is not just, and of course I don't mean just, I'm a psychologist, but is not a mental health diagnosis per se, in that it enables an individual with this disability to have an array of supports throughout their life that most likely most people with mental health diagnoses do not have. So it leads to a range of cognitive, behavioral, and physical deficits. And but it is really important, I think, to note that this is a whole body diagnosis. When this diagnosis came to be 50 plus years ago, and even as recently, I would say, as 14 years ago, and there was no kind of looking at much at how the whole body could be affected. It is a brain, you know, it does affect the brain. There are 428 comorbid medical conditions that have been identified with this diagnosis. For most people, the physical effects, at least, well, they're either really strong in the beginning, and those persist throughout, but many people avoid some of those medical conditions until they are older. And one thing, for example, that we know is that there is earlier onset of Alzheimer's for those individuals with an FASD. But it is a whole body diagnosis, and you're going to hear me say that probably more times than you want. The study by Phil May that was published in 2018, February 2018, found that 1 in 20 children may have FASD. This was published at first in Lancet, which is a very well-respected medical journal. If you think about 1 in 20, you think about your child or your niece or your nephew in school, they're lucky if they only have 20 kids in a classroom, right? We all know that there's, you know, can be 30 in a classroom in most schools. But if there are 20, one of those children is going to have an FASD if they're diagnosed, but we're going to get to that. That is astounding. If you think about how many people know about autism, especially in North Carolina and especially around the Triangle with the TEACH program at UNC, and loads of people move here that are financially able, job mobility, etc., to move to this area for the TEACH program. But that is 1 in 57, 58. I believe that's the most recent prevalence. I'm not saying autism is not as important, but you can see that we're not at the same stage of development in terms of awareness, which is why we started this nonprofit. Because, you know, people say to me, where's your daughter on the spectrum? And I say, well, she's on a different spectrum. And they look at me like, what the heck is she talking about? Because they just make an assumption if we're at some special needs event or equestrian Special Olympics or something that she has autism. So whatever terminology we use, it's really important that you remember that you can have, that child or that adult can have problems in all of these areas: physical, mental, behavioral, learning, intellect, and maturity. Okay, so you know, any of those. Some of those depends on the person. Again, it's a spectrum. These are the projected numbers in North Carolina. I took this from the state statistics about how many live births there were last year. This does not include miscarriage or stillbirth, which some of those situations may be the result of alcohol use. And if we look at 5%, that means there's around 6,000 children a year born with exposure to alcohol to the degree that it could be diagnosed if it were pursued. That's pretty huge to my mind. So what are the myths? Kieran O'Malley from Ireland is one of my favorite psychiatrists, or probably my favorite psychiatrist, and he says the minute, I can't do his Irish accent, sorry. But he says the minute pursuit of the facial dysmorphology only serves to prolong denial of this universal societal public health problem. And that is because 50 years ago, it was dysmorphologists who coined the phrase fetal alcohol syndrome. And that referred to the dysmorphology of the face. As time has gone on and research has progressed, we know that 90% of the time, FASD is an invisible disability. There is no quote unquote face, as I call it. And this is why so many of us have difficulties in having our children diagnosed, because they don't quote unquote look like they have FASD. Well, guess what? 90% of those affected by alcohol in utero to the point of a developmental disability don't look like that. So focusing on that, I don't show the face anymore because people would say years later, oh, I remember that face you showed me. And I'm like, that's not what I wanted you to remember. So what we see is the tip of the iceberg, and everything below the waterline is what are all the other people that are affected by alcohol in utero. Another myth is that only alcoholics have children with an FASD. It's safe to have a quote unquote regular, whatever that is, glass of wine or other alcoholic beverage during pregnancy, and drinking in moderation will not cause FASD. There are still to this day physicians here and in other countries telling women that they can have a glass of wine at the end of the day, or if they drink moderately, it's okay. First of all, I don't know what moderate is. If I was drinking 8 drinks a day and someone said, well, I want you to be moderate, maybe I would drink 4. You know, what's moderate? First of all, that's a problem. But the point is that any kind of alcohol. I did a workshop in Virginia, 8 years ago, maybe, with high school counselors. And I had glasses and cans and martini glasses and wine glasses, etc., and hard cider. And I had the hard alcohol over here and the beer in the middle and the wine. And I said, which of these can pregnant women drink? I was flabbergasted that probably a quarter of the people there said wine was okay. Like wine isn't alcohol, it doesn't really count, right? But low to moderate consumption of alcohol crosses the placenta. It can interfere with normal development of the fetus. And again, it affects the whole body, but today our focus is the brain. 1 ounce of alcohol dissolves about 10,000 cells in the developing brain. So if you think about a 4-ounce drink, that's 40,000. But when you when you lose 1 cell, you've lost 40,000, you lose 40 times trillions. I don't even know what that is, truthfully, a lot of neural networks of cells that were to develop from that 1 cell. So we can see it has a huge impact. And I've placed a shot of a brain that has been affected by alcohol in utero. And in fact, as I look at it right now, it's not all that dissimilar to one that my daughter had at 8 years old. And I remember I was sitting in front of the fireplace one night and the doc called and he said, you know, the brain looks fine. I see some hot spots. And I'm like, hot spots, those are those white things you see there. He said, yeah, but you know, that's nothing to be concerned about. I said, okay. I didn't say okay, but I said okay. So what we say is there's no safe time, no safe amount. And we also give the advice that women who are drinking and want to get pregnant should stop 3 months before they want to start trying to become pregnant, as should their male partners, because we know that women drink most likely with the males in their life. So we ask that males also don't do that, also don't drink, but we also know that alcohol affects sperm. That doesn't mean that the male causes FASD. FASD is exposure to the fetus, but it can add to the learning disabilities or can cause learning disabilities in an otherwise child who has never been exposed to alcohol by the mother. So alcohol's effect does not discriminate. It's all women, age, race, socioeconomic class, anywhere people drink, and any kind of alcohol, hard alcohol, wine, beer. Additional myths, and I put these on one slide, not because I think they're less important, but I realized I was getting lots of slides. So one is that it's a childhood disorder that goes away as the person ages. Not true. My daughter will be 27 in April. It is a lifelong developmental disability, and I will talk about some of the ramifications of that in a little bit. The other myth I wanted to hit on was that all people with FASDs have low IQs. That is not true. The testing that I know that's been published goes from 29 IQ to 135, 100 being the kind of typical, give or take 10 points, the typical IQ. In fact, those with FASD tend to cluster around 90, but not all. I mean, again, it's a spectrum disorder. It's affected by undoubtedly how much exposure to alcohol, and it results in different levels of functioning. I will say it's been my observation that those with higher IQs tend to have more difficulty because they tend to be more streetwise and get into more trouble as a result. But that's anecdotal from the families that I've consulted with. This next myth really irks me. Well, there aren't very many specific treatment options and supports, so we just don't have to worry about getting a diagnosis. Absolutely not. One thing we know is that the more people get diagnosed with any specific disorder, disability, the more research money goes into that, which also means that more treatment options become available, more supports, more people understand how to help that person be successful in their lives. And I'm going to talk about the misdiagnoses that our children often have. And I think that you will begin to see tonight how important it is that there really is a concrete FASD diagnosis, something under that umbrella. in terms of the kind of assistance they can get, how we would interact with them to promote the best for their life, etc. The other myth is that adults cannot get diagnosed. That is not true. It is much harder to get diagnosed as an adult. And when I say that, I mean 18 and over, and I mean 18. If you're 17 and 10 months old, you can get into a pediatric clinic that diagnoses, but if you're 18, that opportunity is gone in most cases. One of the difficulties everyone has in getting a diagnosis is maternal confirmation. And truthfully, that depends on who you go to to some extent. But many clinics will use the Washington 4-digit diagnostic points, and one of them is maternal confirmation. That makes it very, very difficult for those of us who have foster and or adopted kids who we suspect have an FASD, because it is not often, perhaps, that we would have that confirmation. More and more places will take anecdotal data or corroborative data. So if a husband will say, or the father will say, yes, she drank throughout pregnancy, and put it in writing, or a grandmother, a grandfather, a sister, etc., would put that in writing and truthfully say, yes, she did drink, even if the mother is not available to confirm that or refuses to confirm that. The other thing I think we need to realize is that, and I've had so many people say this to me, oh, my daughter's biological mother only did drugs. That doesn't happen a lot. You know, people who use alcohol may not use drugs, but given alcohol is socially accepted, you go to parties with alcohol, and you may be using drugs, it's highly likely that you also exposed your fetus to alcohol, not just drugs. So, you know, drugs and alcohol often go hand in hand. I saw a study recently where in New Hampshire, 90% of the women using opioids also drank. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. And, you know, when you get older, it may be harder to get this maternal confirmation. I worked with a wonderful social worker in Chatham County, just south of Chapel Hill, where I live. And she had been to several trainings. She was with the school, and the child had, I realize I talk with my hands and you can't see my hands. But the child, she brought the child's folder from school to meet with me to look up some things. And I'm not kidding, it was this deep. He was in 5th grade, and he had all this. And she went through it, starting at the beginning, which no one had done. And she found where it was noted in the first few pages of his file that his mother drank during pregnancy. And so that child was able to be diagnosed. I know other people who have been able to get birth records. So, you know, it's going to depend on the situation, but I certainly would not give up if you didn't have maternal confirmation. I did not have maternal confirmation. My daughter's from Russia. And when she was 10 and a half and finally diagnosed, after I asked every specialist, I kept saying, I think she's been exposed to alcohol. And they would either say no adamantly or shrug their shoulders. In other words, they didn't know. And so and then Google came to play. about 16 years ago. And I was Googling and Googling, and I found a clinic, a diagnostic clinic within 8 miles of everyone all the specialists she had seen in Chicago. And I feel like when we walked through the doorway, she was diagnosed. I had all of her testing, etc. And I said to the physician that started this clinic many, many years ago, and after he retired, I was talking to him and I said, well, why didn't you require maternal confirmation? He said, if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. We don't feel like we need that. I will say that they are an exception. And someone told me recently that they don't do that anymore since he's retired, but I don't know if that's true. So what are the red flags? How do we come to suspect that there may be a child or an adult in our life who has been exposed to alcohol in utero? I'm going to let you read these for a minute while I have a glass of water. You notice that I moved down the presence of facial dysmorphology. It's not at the top. If there's a biological sibling with an FASD diagnosis, that may be an indicator. I do know a family that has a sibling set of 3 children and the middle one has no FASD. Since everyone's muted, I won't ask you what your guesses are about that, but the mother was incarcerated for pretty much all of her pregnancy, so she wasn't drinking. So her first child had FASD. Her third child had FASD, but not the middle one. In the foster care system, I think that's why most of you are here tonight. The estimates of those who would have an FASD, if they were evaluated, that come from the foster care system is between 62 and 80%. This should not be surprising given why children are put in care. It may fall under different categories. It may be neglect. That doesn't mean that there wasn't drinking. Maybe it doesn't mean that it wasn't blatant over drinking, but as I said before, drinking is drinking to the fetus, potentially. And I think the other clear sign is that there are multiple co-occurring disorders that don't quite fit and don't respond typically to interventions, and whether those interventions are medications or behavioral interventions, that is therapy. My daughter had 10 diagnoses by the time she got what I considered to be the right diagnosis. And actually, it's not that some of those other diagnoses are not accurate, but they didn't show the whole picture. They didn't show the underlying cause of the behaviors that she was showing. Now here, Gail, is the link I'd like you to put into the chat box, because I'm going to go right along and move past this slide. But there's a very good overlapping characteristics chart that has been updated and done over the years by a variety of people. And it shows the similarities between FASD, ADHD, which tends to be almost every child's first diagnosis with an FASD, ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, OCD, obsessive compulsive, RAD, which to my mind is so over diagnosed, and a bevy of other situations of overlapping characteristics. And you will see some of those on that chart, and that will take you to the chart.
And so let me out any of these websites and stuff, I will put in the email that I send out with the evaluation, with the certificate. So you don't have to worry about, yeah, I'll put that in there.
Okay. So what are the primary characteristics of an FASD? They're behavioral symptoms that are based on differences in brain structure and function. Brain differences. But it's the symptoms that lead to the inaccurate diagnosis because no one thinks to examine whether there is an underlying brain difference. I'm going to let you read that. I feel like it may sound circular, but it's not. So these behavioral characteristics are our first clue that there may be in front of us an individual who has been exposed to alcohol in utero. These are other primary characteristics. Dysmaturity. That means a significant developmental difference from same age peers. And you may see that in parallel play. You may see that in being able to communicate with other individuals, of being able to talk to adults versus children. And some of that is because it's often easier to talk to adults because we carry the conversation more. If there's a hesitation, we will jump in to kind of help them facilitate, to grease the wheels, so to speak. There's uneven development. And what I mean by that is a child may comprehend, or I should say, may read very well, but their comprehension is is stunted. And usually we might, when I graph this about an individual that I'm working with, I often will put, grade wise. And, this is not scientific. We don't know necessarily that, well, with reading, often you do, that they read at a 3rd grade level, but they comprehend at a 1st grade level or something like that. But we see this uneven development across many parameters. That may be with math, socially, with skills, daily skills, hygiene. There's uneven development. And they may be, I know one young man now in his late 20s who, when I met him 12 years ago, his drawings were unbelievable, just unbelievable. And so his development, it really looked like he probably had been an art student, maybe at an art institute. He could do 3-dimensional, he could look at a car and you would be able to see it because it looked like the car. It wasn't just flat. Yet his reading comprehension was, about 4th grade. His math was very low, etc. Then we're probably all aware of sensory system challenges, and some are sensory seekers and some are sensory avoiders. Loud noises, this is where this overlaps with autism, is that loud noises often really, really bother someone with either an FASD or autism. The next one is concrete or literal. And I don't know if my daughter's still up, but I always tell this story and she knows I do this. I was going outside for 15 minutes, or I ran to the store or something, and I said, I need you to clean your bathroom sink. And I came back and I said, you didn't clean your sink. She said, yes, I did. There's the sponge right in the sink. Well, I meant the whole vanity top and the sink. So not only did she leave the sponge out, but she didn't clean the whole thing. But I had said sink, and that's what she did. Okay. Often there's not a transfer of, we, in different parts of the United States, for example, we use different words for things. She grew up in the Midwest until she was 12, and we called it laundry. Someone said to her, "It's time to do your wash." And she just looked at them. And the woman said, "I said it to her 5 times. What's wrong with her?" And I said, "We say laundry." That didn't compute for her because that wasn't a word we use. The same with, swear versus cuss. Someone kept saying to her, "Cuss, you shouldn't cuss." And finally I said, "Do you know what that word means?" She said, "I have no idea." Because she couldn't transfer that. As adults or as children get older, they can do that. I've underlined this. I'm not going to talk about it but a second, but it's really, really important that we find a child's strengths. This is important for anybody, but especially for a child with a developmental disability that can be as devastating as FASD is. We need to find a strength because in so many ways we can use that to enhance their learning and their development as an individual, academically. We can use it in math, we can use their strengths and their interests in a lot of ways to enhance their lives. And then finally, executive function challenges. And I liked, one person calls this the air traffic controller of the mind. We all use executive functions every single day. We may have thought last night, "Oh, we're going to have dinner early tonight, tomorrow night, because I'm going to attend this webinar." Or when we used to go places for trainings, we'd think about, some of us would think about, what am I going to wear? How long is it going to take me to drive there? How do I estimate when I'm going to have to leave someplace to get to that place? And that affects every single part of our lives every day. We don't know it. We don't have to think about it because it's just something that develops. And executive functioning becomes very important in school at about 3rd grade. I'm going to go on because I think I'm talking a lot here. But I do want to say that these are the executive functions that we use. Cause and effect. I did this and this happened. So I shouldn't do that again. But if you don't realize those two things are connected, that A and B are connected, then you're going to do it again. You can't generalize if you have executive functioning deficits. You can't say, "Well, this isn't exactly like that situation that I got in trouble for, but it's probably enough that this probably isn't a good idea." Zip, often generalization. Working memory, that is how we pull our memory together to be able to, for example, respond to a question. What did you do at school today? It might be one. First of all, that's way too broad of a question. And you're probably going to get nowhere. But if you can't say, "Well, I always have gym during my first period, and then we have reading, and then we read this, and gym, we did this," you kind of pull your those pockets of memories together to put together a story, an answer, etc. Problem solving. We need executive functions to problem solve. How can I fix this thing in front of me. If we don't know cause and effect in these others, we can't problem solve. If we can't, think about planning and organization and thinking ahead and how important those are, not only to our daily lives, but our jobs, our careers, etc. They're vitally important. And these are lifelong challenges for a person with FASD. You do not grow out of them. You may get somewhat better, so to speak, better at understanding, but it oftentimes has to be a very specific training almost to be able to, and life experience to improve those. But I know individuals that are 50, 60 years old and they say, my executive functioning still is my problem. And then you think about what I said here, required for impulse control. Well, that's why you get a response like that sometimes, because there is no impulse control because of the lack of executive functioning or the deficits. Secondary characteristics are problems that are not part of the FASD per se. Okay, they're the fallout that occurs because of the result of expectations that the child is neurotypical. And this is why we see the child starting to nosedive as they get older and progress through elementary school, because they look neurotypical, unless they don't, that 10%. And well, if they would just try harder, it's that they're not trying hard enough. It's not that they can't do it, it's that they won't do it. And it's like trying to put a square peg into a round hole. And we know that does not work. Although I know a father who told me in no uncertain terms that his square peg 2 children with FASD were going to fit in a round hole, by golly. I kind of doubt that, and I haven't seen him in about 8 years because he didn't believe what I was saying. So what are our typical reactions to unrealistic expectations? What if we get a job as a computer programmer and we're a psychologist? All of these are very typical of what somebody would feel if somebody is expecting something of you that you just can't do. It's not that you don't want to, you want desperately to be able to do it, but you can't. And so when you have this list of different reactions, feelings that turn into behaviors, guess what? You get lots of diagnoses. The mother of FASD in Seattle that worked initially with was a pioneer, and Struthguth, German, did a study probably 40 years ago now. Unfortunately, these numbers have not changed in terms of individuals with FASD having mental health problems, problems with employment, etc., as you see them here. I would say that's not because those can't go down, those numbers, but it's because we do not diagnose people and use the appropriate interventions, whether those be medication or teaching or teaching, whether within the family, within school, or whatever, counseling. We believe that about 50% of prisons and jails are individuals with an FASD. You think about the impulse control. there's one right there. Alcohol and drugs are used to push down the feelings that were on that previous slide that I showed you. Self-medicating. Okay, I wanted to leave time. Okay, I did. Leave time for questions. These are some great resources. The first is Diane Melvin's book, Trying Harder Rather Than Differently. She has developed the neurobehavioral approach. We're going to be talking about that next week. And it's just an introduction. I went to a 3-day intensive workshop with her from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m., including lunchtime for 3 days in Portland. So, you know, you're just going to get a little snippet of this. This is a very small book, but a very powerful book. And she does have some workshops. That organization, she's retired now, but facets.org has just announced a series of workshops coming up in April. We have NCFASD Informed has 17 podcasts. You can access those through this link. If you're going to be coming next week, I suggest you might want to look especially at 2 of them as preparation, so it'll be a little more understandable. And that is Adrian Pashista talking about the neurobehavioral approach, and Wendy, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on her last name, talking about neurobehavioral accommodations as a result of using this approach to children and adults with FASD. There are an amazing number of Facebook pages on FASD. These are the ones that, you know, Flying with Broken Wings was started by adults with FASD, and I mean midlife adults, 50s. Shifting the Paradigm is based on the neurobehavioral approach. And then there's various parenting page for different age groups. And then for older children, there is, I should say 15 and up, there is a listserv, a Google group for parents of older children, which is really, really helpful. And some of those people have children up to 40 and 50 years old. And then finally, the FASD toolkit, which I really wish pediatricians would read, but I'm not encouraged that they're not saying, gee, I think your child might have an FASD, and pushing people in the direction of being evaluated. That's the podcast. So I have that twice. Sorry. Okay.
So I have the questions that were asked while you were presenting, and I've written them down. So I'm going to ask them, and I put all of your links that you had in your presentation over in the chat as you went, and the ones at the end also. So the first question is, do other countries recognize FASD as a diagnosis?
Canada uses that term, FASD, Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder. Those diagnoses underneath that, that umbrella, just as we do, they do. I have had the privilege of being able to go to the Vancouver International FASD conference probably about 10 times. And it is a gathering of people from all over the world, including parents, and every other year individuals with an FASD are welcome to come, and they have their own track, and they hang out together, and they do neat things. And one year, actually several years, they have researchers that represent different countries talking about prevalence and acceptance or non-acceptance of the exposure to alcohol. There was an article that came out this week about Russia specifically, and Ukraine. I think it was Russia and Ukraine, and what they believe the prevalence to be. So Phil May, who I mentioned earlier, who is at UNC, he has done about 35, 40 years of research in South Africa. And so he has followed these people very effectively and has garnered lots of information that's very useful to us. But there isn't a country that doesn't have it where people drink, including Muslim countries.
Okay. So number 2 is, what is the process to get a child diagnosed and where in North Carolina?
In North Carolina, we have a very low diagnostic capacity. That is not uncommon. We are not alone in that. Many times I wished I lived in Minnesota or Alaska. I think they probably have the highest recognition of FASD and ability to diagnose. We have 3 different places in North Carolina that say we do evaluations. One is at the Fullerton Clinic in Asheville. One is at Vidant in
Charlotte.
No, Atrium is in Charlotte, and Vidant is in Greenville. Unless Atrium, no, I know Atrium hasn't changed. They used to be something else, but now they're Atrium. And Yasmin Centurious is there, and she is extremely well known, and she came here and started doing diagnoses and has a clinic. They have very few spots. The one in with ECU, associated with ECU, that is Greenville, right? Yeah, Greenville. Yeah. Sorry, I'm from New York. There's only one woman, and she really is a researcher. She has some slots to evaluate, but she does not have a clinic per se. There is a clinic in Asheville and a clinic in Charlotte. There are individual practitioners that will diagnose, but they're few and far between, and you just happen upon them usually. What you need is to go to a clinic is a referral from a pediatrician or your family doc. And it's usually best if you have a full neuropsych battery to go with that. You have, and then Dr. Centurious and Fullerton will tell you what kind of records you need to bring, but it's a multidisciplinary approach.
All right, and then number 3 is, how is it determined if a child is FASD or affected by drugs? So is the affect on the brain due to alcohol, or is it due to drugs? How do you tell the difference, or can you tell the difference?
Well, children with a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder do often have learning disabilities. As a matter of fact, executive functioning is a kind of learning disability. Individuals that have been exposed to drugs are going to have learning disabilities, but they're not going to have the developmental disability, which includes a broader range of impacts on the developing body, etc. Yeah, so but I will say again, as Phil May says, alcohol is the big dog. If you are seeing lots of problems and they're not responding in a typical fashion to medications that are usually used or to counseling, it probably isn't just drugs. It's probably alcohol too, or it may have not been drugs at all.
Yep. Okay, well, Kathy, this has been amazing. The comments were nothing but, this is great training, and thank you, thank you, thank you. So the next, you want to give them just a teaser for next week, what it's going to look like. same time, Thursday night, 7 o'clock, and then Kathy's going to pick up with.
Neurobehavioral approach and accommodations. And, you know, it's going to be short. I know I talked fast, and I'm going to have to talk faster next week because this is really 101, FASD 101, and next week is Neurobehavioral Approach 101. And it informs us as to how we need to approach our children and interact with them so that they can be more successful than they are without this approach. And while it is not considered evidence based, it will never be evidence-based because you need everybody in their life to be doing this. And there's no way, I don't think that you can make it evidence-based, but I can tell you it turned our life around, and it turned around the lives of so many people, some of whom I recognize when they signed in.
Yep. And just so you guys know, the neurobehavioral approach doesn't just work with kids with, you know, alcohol impacted brains. I mean, I used it in the classroom with kids that I taught that had different kinds of disabilities. So don't just think it's only going to be for kids that have alcohol exposure.
That's really, really important. Any kind of brain difference. But you know what I always say, it's not going to hurt anybody. It's not going to hurt your typical neurotypical child. I mean, it's a wonderful approach.
Yep. All right. And the last thing, just some housekeeping. If you registered for tonight, you do not need to register for next Thursday. And all I'm going to do is send you the same link that I sent you tonight to log in. You just hop on and do that. And Hannah, that's Karen. I will absolutely include an email that says, fill this out for credit. If you did not, the evaluation, if you need that. And you guys just hop on Thursday night and we'll do it again. If you have new people that need to register, not a problem. Send them our way and we'll get new people hopped in. For the professionals that are on, share it with other people. Next week will be really a great, for any parent that's doing therapeutic, any parent that's got a child with any kind of behavior. And we will see you next Thursday night at 7 o'clock.
Can I say one more thing about evaluation? Most of the genetics centers in North Carolina, including UNC and Duke, only diagnose FAS. They do not diagnose on the spectrum. And that's pretty much clear. That's true with every genetics center that I know in the state, unless that's changed in the last couple of years. When I called, that was all that they diagnosed, and then they send you someplace else. So unless you know your child probably has full FAS, I would just go to a different place to begin with, because otherwise you're going to spend lots of time.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everybody for being here.
All right. We will see you Thursday. Good night.
Good night.
Night. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. You're amazing.
Thank you.
Good night. Have a wonderful evening.
You too. Bye, guys. I'm going to end it for everyone.